Welcome to Dear Fans. It was still early in the morning when Caitlin Clark parked her old battered sedan in the far corner of the Oxbridge Academy parking lot. She always chose the same spot a little out of the way to avoid drawing attention to the vehicle's peeling paint and dented bumper. The engine gave one final cough before dying, and Caitlin sighed, gripping the steering wheel for a moment. Another day, another chance to make an S. Meet. She grabbed her thermos from the passenger seat, gave the dashboard a gent pat ass. If to thank the car for holding on another day, and stepped out. The early morning air was cool, and the world was still quiet except for the faint chirp of birds and the distant rumble of a delivery truck. Rockbridge Academy was coming to life slowly, and Caitlin liked it that way. It gave her a moment of peace before the chaos of the day began. Pushing her trusty cleaning cart down the empty corridors, she felt a sense of pride. The floors gleamed under the overhead lights, the result of her meticulous care. She knew most people didn't notice, but that didn't matter to her. For Caitlin, it wasn't about recognition, it was about doing the job right. Every classroom, every hallway, every trash can she approached them all with the same quiet dedication to the students. Caitlin was simply M. Clark, the janitor, who always seemed to have a kind word or a warm smile ready. She knew their names, their favorite sports, even their quirks. Good morning, Marcus. How's that science project coming along? Hey, Jenny, I saw that goal you scored yesterday. Impressive. These small exchanges were a part of her daily rhythm, a way to connect in a role that often felt invisible, yet her kindness never faltered even when her body ached from hours of scrubbing and mopping. But outside these walls, life wasn't as polished. Caitlin had faced more struggles than most could imagine. She had grown up in a small town where opportunities were few and far between. Losing her wife to cancer years ago had been the hardest blow of all. Suddenly, Caitlin was both mother and father to their two children, juggling the roles of provider, caretaker, and disciplinarian. She worked long hours to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads, sacrificing her own comfort to give her kids a shot at a better future. The old sedan was a daily reminder of those sacrifices. Things sputtered more often than it purred, and every commute was a gamble. Some mornings it refused to start altogether, forcing Caitlin to rely on borrowed rides or long walks, but she never let it dampen her spirit. One day at a time, Caitlin would tell herself as she tightened her grip on the steering wheel and coaxed the car into motion. Despite her own hardships, Caitlin never lost sight of what mattered. Her children were her world, and everything she did was for them. She dreamed of seeing them succeed in ways she never could, and that dream kept her going even on the hardest days. Unbeknownst to her, Caitlin's quiet resilience and unwavering kindness hadn't gone unnoticed. One student in particular, Baron Trump, had been paying close attention to her for the most part. Baron was just another student at Oxbridge, reserved, a little shy, but always polite. Yet behind his quiet demeanor there was a sharp eye and an even sharper sense of empathy. Baron saw things that others missed, and lately he had been watching Mrs. Clark. It started with little observations: the way Caitlin always greeted everyone with a smile, even when she looked tired, the careful way she went about her work, ensuring every detail was perfect, and the moments when she thought no one was watching, like the time Baron saw her replace a broken locker handle before any student even reported it. There was something about Miss Clark that stuck with Baron, something that made him want to know more. But Caitlin had no idea that her simple acts of kindness were about to spark something extraordinary, a moment that would change her life forever. Baron Trump had always been different from the other students at Oxbridge Academy. While his peers chatted about the latest trends, compared luxuriations, or argued over whose family had the better car, Baron often found himself on the fringes, observing. He wasn't uninterested, just thought raised with the idea that everyone's story mattered. Baron learned early on to pay attention to people, not just their words, but their actions, their struggles, and the little things that often went unnoticed. It was during one of those moments of quiet observation that Baron started to really notice Miss Clark. To most of the students, the janitor was a background figure, someone who faded into the fabric of the school. But to Baron, Caitlin Clark stood out. He saw the way she always arrived early, coffee thermos in hand, her cleaning cart rattling softly as she navigated the hallways. He noticed the care with which she did her job, wiping down desks, polishing floors, ensuring the school felt more like a second home than just a building. At first, Baron didn't think much of it. It was just Mrs. Clark doing her job right. But one day, as Baron waited outside for his ride after school, he saw something that stuck with him. Across the parking lot, Caitlin was hunched over the hood of her car, tools spread out on the ground, her old sedan, hat stalled against smoke rising faintly from the engine. Caitlin's sleeves were rolled up her hands smeared with grease, as she worked tirelessly even as the Florida sun beat down on her. When the car finally sputtered to life, Barron watched as Caitlin wiped her forehead with a rag, muttered something under her breath, and climbed into the driver's seat. The sight stayed with him. The more Barron noticed, the more questions he had. Why was Miss Clark driving a car that barely ran? How did she manage to show up every day with the same warm smile and kind words despite what looked like endless struggles? One afternoon, Barron worked up the courage to approach her. He caught Caitlin by the lockers fixing a broken hinge that no one else seemed to notice. "Hey, Miss Clark," Barron said. "Han'll need a hand." Caitlin glanced up surprised. "Well, hello there, young man," she said with a grin. "I think I've got it, but I appreciate the offer." Barron lingered, watching as Caitlin finished the repair. "You're always fixing things," Barron said after a pause. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Caitlin laughed, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to carry the weight of her years. "Oh, sure, but someone's got to do it, right? Besides, there's something satisfying about making things work." Again, that conversation was the first of many. Over time, Barron began to learn more about Caitlin. He learned about her two kids, how her son dreamed of becoming a mechanical engineer, and her daughter wanted to be a teacher. He heard stories about Caitlin's late wife, the love of her life, and how her loss had shaped her into the person she was today. Caitlin never complained, but Barron could hear the undertone of exhaustion in her voice, the subtle hints of the sacrifices she made daily to provide for her family. One day, Barron asked the question that had been on his mind since that moment in the parking lot. "Miss Clark," he asked, "why don't you get a new car? That one looks like it's ready to give up on you." Caitlin chuckled, shaking her head. "A new car? How all those things cost money, Barron, and money is not something I've got a lot of. Besides, as long as it gets me where I need to go, it's good enough for me." But Barron couldn't shake the thought. The more he learned about Caitlin, the more he felt the weight of her story. Caitlin Clark wasn't just a janitor. She was a mother, mentor, and an unsung hero of the school. She quietly poured her heart into everything she did, asking for nothing in return. It didn't sit right with Barron. He knew he couldn't solve all of Caitlin's problems, but maybe, just maybe, he could do something to make her life a little easier. That night at dinner, Barron brought it up with his parents. "You know Miss Clark, the janitor at school?" he asked, pushing his food around on his PL's father nodded. "The one who's always smiling?" "Yeah, I've seen her," Bear and set his fork down, his expression serious. "I think we should help her. Her car barely runs, and she works so hard for everyone at school. She never asks for anything, but she deserves more." His mother tilted her head, studying him. "What are you thinking, Barron?" Barron hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I want to get her a car, something reliable, something she doesn't have to fix every weekend just to get to work." As parents exchanged a glance, "That's a big gesture, son," his father said carefully. "Do you have a plan?" "I'll figure it out," Barron replied, his voice resolute. "She's done so much for all of us, and I can't just sit by and do nothing." As determined as Barron was, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't pull this off alone. Once the idea of helping Mrs. Clark took root, Barron couldn't let it go. Every time he saw her mopping floors or fixing broken lockers, he felt a growing sense of urgency. But this wasn't a simple task. Buying a car wasn't something a teenager could do on a whim. He needed a plan, and more importantly, he needed help. Barron started by talking to his parents again. "I don't want this to just be for me," he explained one evening over dinner. "It should come from everyone at the school. Miss Clark has touched so many lives here. I think it would mean more if we all pitched." And his father leaned back, nodding thoughtfully. "You're right. This isn't just about money. It's about showing her how much she's appreciated. You need to get people involved, though: teachers, students, staff. Are you ready for that?" Barron hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll do whatever it takes." The next day, Barron started putting his plan into motion. He approached a few trusted classmates, first sharing his idea in hushed tones during lunch. "You know Miss Clark, WR the janitor." He began testing the waters. "Of course," one of his friends said. "She's awesome." "Why?" Barron leaned in, his voice low. "I want to get her a new car. Hers is falling apart, and she works so hard for all of us. I think it's time we did something for her." The initial reactions were a mix of surprise and excitement. "That's huge," one friend said. "How are we supposed to pull that off?" "Figure it out," Barron replied. "I'm not asking for a lot from anyone, just whatever they can give. If we all chip, and even just a little add up." Word began to spread quietly. Barron approached teachers, coaches, and even the school count, explaining his plan. The response was overwhelmingly positive. "Miss Clark is one of the hardest working people here," one teacher said, slipping Barron a $50 bill. "Count me in." But Barron knew that even with everyone's contributions, the cost of a new car was steep. That's when his parents stepped in. His father contacted a local car dealership explaining the situation. The dealership manager, touched by the story, offered to sell a brand new red Jeep SUV at a significant discount. "We'll cover the rest," Baron's father said. "You just focus on making this special for her." With a car secured, the focus shifted to the reveal. Baron wanted it to be a moment Miss Clark would never forget. After some brainstorming with his friends and teachers, they decided to make the upcoming Friday assemble the stage for the big surprise. It was perfect. Everyone would be there, and they could present the gift in front of the entire school. The preparations kicked into high gear. Students created a giant banner that read, "Thank you, Miss Clark." They painted it in the school's colors and decorated it with messages of gratitude. Teachers worked behind the scenes to coordinate the logistics, ensuring Caitlin would be at the assembly. Without suspecting anything, Baron rehearsed his speech late into the night, pacing his room as he practiced the words that he hoped would convey just how much Miss Clark meant to everyone. As the days ticked by, the excitement at the school grew. Students whispered about the plan in the hallways, careful not to let Miss Clark overhear. Even the staff joined, contributing to the fund and sharing stories about how Caitlin had made their days brighter. "He once stayed late to help me find a student's lost backpack," one teacher recalled. "He didn't have to, but he did it anyway." By Thursday afternoon, everything was ready. The car sat hidden behind the gym, freshly washed and gleaming in the sunlight. The banner was hung, the speeches were finalized, and every detail had been meticulously planned. But as the big day approached, Baron couldn't shake the nervous energy building inside him. "What if it doesn't go the way I'm imagining?" he asked his mother that evening, his voice tinged with doubt. She smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Baron, this isn't just about the car, it's about showing her how much she's valued, and that's something no one can misunderstand." Friday morning arrived, and the energy at Oxbridge Academy was electric. Students filed into the auditorium, buzzing with anticipation. Baron stood backstage, clutching his note cards, taking deep breaths to stood himself. He glanced out at the crowd and saw Miss Clark quietly taking a seat near the back, looking as unassuming as ever. The sight filled Baron with a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about a car, it was about honoring a woman who had given so much to everyone without ever asking for anything in return. But as the curtains rose and the room fell silent, and wondered, would Miss Clark truly understand how much she meant to all of them? Friday morning felt like any other day to Caitlin CLK. The air was crisp as she parked her old sedan in its usual spot at the far end of the Oxbridge Academy parking lot. The engine wheezed and groaned before finally giving in with a sputtering halt. Caitlin sat for a moment, taking a deep breath, mentally preparing for the long day ahead. Her morning routine was predictable. Mop buckets, floors to polish, classrooms to tidy. She loved the rhythm of it, though hard work never bothered her. It was her way of keeping things in order, even when life outside the school walls felt chaotic. But today was different, even if Caitlin didn't know it yet. Around mid-morning, as Caitlin wheeled her cleaning cart down the hallway, the voice of the headmaster came over the intercom. "Good morning, students and staff. Please report to the auditorium for a special assembly. We look forward to seeing you all there." Caitlin barely registered the announcement. Assemblies were common at Oxbridge Academy, and they didn't usually involve her. She figured she'd stick to her routine, maybe get ahead on some maintenance work while the building was quiet. But then one of the teachers approached her with a smile. "You should come to Miss Clark. You're going to want to see this." Reluctantly, she followed the flow of students and staff toward the auditorium. She slipped into the back row, hoping to blend into the crowd. The large room buzzed with excitement, though Caitlin couldn't quite put her finger on why. She watched as the headmaster took the stage, greeted by enthusiastic applause. He spoke briefly, welcoming everyone and explaining that today's assembly wasn't about academics or announcements. It was about celebrating a member of their community that piqued Caitlin's interest, but she was still clueless as to what was coming. Then Baron Trump walked onto the stage, holding a stack of note cards. Caitlin knew Baron. He was the quiet, observant type who always greeted her politely in the hallways. Caitlin smiled faintly, assuming the boy must have done something impressive to be given the stage. "Good morning, everyone," Baron began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I'm here today because there's someone at this school who deserves recognition, someone who makes this place better every single day." Caitlin shifted in her seat, her brows furrowing slightly. She looked around, wondering who Baron could be talking about. "I'm talking about Miss Clark," Baron continued, and the room erupted in applause. Caitlin froze, completely caught off guard. Her hands gripped the edges of her chair as she stared at the young man on stage. Baron smiled at the crowd waiting for the Noise to die down before continuing. Clark isn't just our janitor. She's the one who shows up every morning to make sure our classrooms are spotless, our hallways are clean, and our school feels like home. She's the one who fixes what's broken, whether it's a locker, a leaky faucet, or even our spirits. When we're having a bad day, the words hit Caitlin like a wave. She had always done her work without expecting thanks, but hearing someone acknowledge it so openly felt overwhelming. The lights dimmed slightly as a video began to play on the large screen behind Baron. It was a montage of clips and photos showing Caitlin at work, mopping floors, repairing broken chairs, carrying supplies. Interspersed were interviews with students and staff sharing how much Caitlin meant to them. "He always has a smile for you," one student said. "He never complains, even when we make his job hard," or another admitted. Sheepishly, laughter rippled through the audience at that, but Caitlin couldn't laugh. She was too stunned, her throat tightening as she tried to process what was happening. By the time the video ended, the entire auditorium was on its feet, clapping and cheering. Baron stepped forward again, his voice unwavering. "Yes, us, Clark, we know you never ask for anything, but we see how hard you work, how much you care, and how you give so much of yourself to this school. Today, we want to give something back to you." Baron gestured toward the side of the stage, where the double doors opened to reveal a gleaming red Jeep SUV, parked under a large banner that read, "Thank you, Miss Clark." The entire room erupted in cheers and applause. Caitlin's jaw dropped as she stared at the car. Her mind struggled to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. "Miss Clark," Baron said, turning toward her with a smile, "this is for you from all of us." The spotlight shifted to Caitlin, who still hadn't moved from her seated. Teacher gently touched her shoulder, urging her to stand. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her legs trembling as she made her way to the stage. The applause seemed deafening, but all Caitlin could focus on was the car and the faces of the students and staff who had come together to make this moment happen. When she finally reached the stage, Baron extended the keys to her. Caitlin hesitated for a moment before taking them, her hands shaking. She looked at Baron, then at the crowd, and finally back at the car. "I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the applause. She wiped at her eyes, which had filled with tears. "You didn't have to do this. I just do my job." But as the cheers grew louder, Caitlin began to realize that this wasn't just about the car. It was about all the lives she had quietly touched, and the community that had come together to remind her that her kindness hadn't gone unnoticed for what felt like an eternity. Caitlin stood frozen on stage, staring at the gleaming red Jeep SUV parked just a few feet away. The keys sat heavy in her hand, and the sheer enormity of the moment pressed down on her. The room was still buzzing with cheers and applause, but for Caitlin, everything seemed to blur. She was overwhelmed, not just by the gift, but by what it represented. She stepped forward slowly, her legs unsteady, and ran a trembling hand along the smooth, polished surface of the car. The bright red paint gleamed under the stage lights, a stark contrast to the battered sedan she had left in the parking lot that morning. Her throat tightened, and when she finally turned back to face the crowd, her eyes were brimming with tears. The auditorium grew quiet, everyone waiting to hear what she would say. I don't know what to say," she began, and her voice thick with emotion. This is more than I could have ever imagined. I don't even know how to thank you." She paused, taking a deep breath as she glanced out at the sea of faces, students, teachers, staff, all looking back at her with warmth and admiration. "I've always believed," she continued, her voice steadier now, "that kindness isn't something you do for recognition, it's something you do because it's the right thing. I've tried to live my life that way, and to see all of you come together like this, it means more than I can ever put into words." The audience erupted into applause again, but Caitlin raised a hand, signaling that she wasn't done. "You know," she began, "when my wife passed away years ago, I didn't think I'd ever feel this kind of joy again. She was my rock, my partner, and losing her left a hole in my heart that I didn't think anything could fill. But I had 2 kids to raise, and I knew I had to keep going for them." Her voice broke slightly as she continued, "Every morning when I get up, I think about them. They're the reason I do what I do, why I work so hard. I want them to see that no matter what life throws at you, you keep pushing forward, you keep giving even when you don't have much to GI." She paused again, glancing down at the keys in her hand. "And now, because of all of you, because of this incredible gift, I can give them a little more. I can get to work without worrying if my car will break down. I can take my daughter to her dance recital without wondering if we'll make it there. This isn't just a car, it's a blessing, one that will change our lives in ways you can't imagine." Tears scammed down her face now, and several in the audience were wiping their eyes too. Caitlin looked at Baron, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Baron, I don't know how you thought of this, but you've done something extraordinary. You saw me, you saw the work due, and you cared enough to make this happen. That means more than I can ever say. She pulled Baron into a hug, holding him tightly as the crowd erupted into applause once again. Like this video and subscribe this channel. Thank you.